So, welcome to Chapter 8. Chapter 8 is a variety of different things, but I want to focus primarily in this chapter on the idea of branding. It was mentioned in Chapter 7 of the definition of branding, and so make sure you've gone back and reviewed that. I'll give you a definition again here in a second. But what we're really going to talk about in this chapter is an in-depth understanding of how a sport brand is developed, how it is marketed by to consumers by sport organizations, and a variety of different case studies in which we can see has been successful in sports. And so what we're going to talk about, sorry, here we go. There we go. What we're going to talk about today is why sport branding is important. Talk about some terms and definitions. That's what this first video is about. Second video you're going to watch will be about the 4 E's of brand equity, which really looks at postmodern culture. And then the last video that you will watch is about cases in sports branding. So let's start today, this first video, talking about why sport branding. We know that, and this is kind of a review from the very first chapter, we know that sports marketing is part of a larger body of knowledge known as lifestyle marketing. Lifestyle marketing is, again, this is a review, is tailoring, excuse me, tailoring the products and promotions that an organization has to fit the purposes of the marketing campaign. In other words, they're essentially looking at the patterns of attitudes and activities of consumers. And so lifestyle marketing is essentially using branding to help validate people's lives. You can't really see this quote. I think my head's in the way. But this is a quote about Nike. What started as a running shoe company now extends to anyone who wants an athletic lifestyle, allowing Nike a presence in product categories such as apparel, watches, and audio equipment. So in other words, what used to be just we produce running shoes is now we validate people's lives through multiple product categories. So the apparel, the watches, the audio equipment, all of those things that really tell us, give us the ability to behave in a way that says something about who we are. So why is branding important? This whole idea. Well, branding is good for firms and branding is good for consumers. And so I want to break this down. So looking at branding, the process of branding a company's products aids in legal protection. Anytime you see the Nike swoosh, it is, if done correctly and legally, we see that is done by Nike. Nike has bought the rights for the Just Do It or the Nike swoosh. You could see the logo, the term, the slogan that is Just Do It, provides legal protection. Nobody else can use that for profit, and if they do, then they have legal action against them. Branding is also good for firms in that it helps consumers recognize a firm's brands from their competition or from another. And so, in other words, it helps brands be distinctive. Sorry, it helps brands become distinctive from their competition. A brand name also may add prestige to a commodity type item. In other words, allows the firm to charge a premium price. And so, for example, a baseball glove is a baseball glove, but a Wilson baseball glove is different than a Spalding, which is different than a Mizuno, which is different from a You Get the Point. The whole thing we're talking about is the brand may add a prestige type item to really a product that does a basic function, which is catch the baseball. Branding may also help build a firm's brand image, and this typically occurs when you're looking at rebranding or changing a brand image. The Miami Marlins is a good example of this. When they went from Florida Marlins to the Miami Marlins, they changed their colors, their logo, basically all they represent, the culture of Miami. We look at the same thing in the Brooklyn Nets in the NBA. When they went from the New Jersey Nets to the Brooklyn Nets, they completely changed their brand to colors to represent the city's colors, black and white, and the culture that comes from being a fan of Brooklyn. So we know that it's good for firms for those reasons. It's also good for consumers, and the reason that may be is very similar to some of the same things for firms. But really, for a consumer, we're always looking for the easiest purchase experience. And so Branding helps simplify this decision-making process, because if I know what good or service is offered, and I've tried it here in the past, I know that that brand is of high quality or of a product category that I want, meaning it may not be necessarily high quality, but of a high value. In other words, words that should never be used, but a cheaper product. But anyway, the point is that may make it easier for them to make a purchase decision. I've had experience with that brand in the past. I enjoyed it, or it fits some sort of categorical need for me. It's also good for consumers because a brand that is regularly purchased has a certain level of quality that you've come to expect. We'll talk about brand loyalty, different levels here in just a little bit. But essentially, a consumer will go back to a product and become more loyal based on previous experiences. We talked about that in Chapter 4 when we're talking about participants' consumer behavior. The way they come about trying to decide which sports to participate in, a lot has to do with internal and external sources of information. Those internal sources of information are our experiences. And so that's why branding is good for a consumer. And then also, branding may satisfy a customer's status, prestige, or identity needs. In other words, this goes back to what we've been talking about the whole semester with social identity theory, where a person tries to behave in a way that associates them with a desired social group. They do things, they say things, they behave in ways that says something about their identity and who they are. And in that, branding gives consumers a easier ability to do that by wearing apparel, behaving in ways that are favorable to a brand. And so this is specifically important in the sport industry, where social identity theory is very important in understanding emotional connections consumers have with brands. So we know that branding is good for firms and good for consumers. Now let's talk about some of the terminology or things you might hear about. One thing that in Chapter 7 we just talked about was this idea of products. The product itself is either a good or a service. However, how is a product any different than a brand? Well, first of all, products are what the company makes. In other words, this is I make a baseball glove. That is a product. However, a brand is what the customer buys. And so, for example, if I buy a baseball glove for the purpose of catching, and I'm really just looking for a baseball glove, that's what the company actually makes. But I buy a Mizuno or I buy a Rawlings. Those are the brands. In other words, there is a thought process of how a consumer makes a decision about a variety of different products. Again, why it's good for firms and good for consumers. A product is homogeneous in nature, meaning everything that is produced in that category of baseball gloves or soccer cleats or whatever they may be, or fitness facility or fitness instruction, like personal trainer. At the end of the day, a personal trainer is a personal trainer. However, a brand, we're talking about personal trainers, a personal brand that is the trainer's brand, differentiates themselves from others. In the same way, what Under Armour did and continues to do with their dry fit clothing, that's moisture wicking material. That is a product. Every company makes something similar to it. Nike, Adidas, Under Armour, you name it, they have moisture wicking material. However, a lot of people still believe that Under Armour's dry fit material is superior, partially because they have first movers advantage, but because they are able to differentiate themselves from other brands based on how they create it. But at the end of the day, it's moisture wicking material and it works, no matter who you buy it from. Products are also limited in functionality. In other words, they do what they're basically supposed to do and nothing more. However, if we look at brands, they're able to evoke some sort of emotion or preference. So that's how we know that there are differences between products and brands. So what is a brand? Well, the first question, is a brand a trademark? Many people think, well, it's just that thing that they put the little registered trademark on. No, this is really just the legal property. Nobody can use we'll talk about logos in a second, but nobody can use the Nike symbol because it has been trademarked. That's just the legal protection. You could ask, well, is brand really just their mission statement, what they stand for? No, this is really a reminder to the consumer what the brand stands for, or what they're essentially trying to do. A lot of people think, well, the brand is the logo, because we look at this term brand going back to, we'll just take the cattle industry, for example. They would brand cattle to basically say, this is my livestock, and by seeing that brand, you have that ownership in it. While that is part of what we're talking about here in branding of products or product categories, really these are just the signatures to tell people that's mine, and similar to the way we saw in the cattle industry and continue to see. Is it a good or a service? No, these are really just the tangibles that come from the purchase of the brand, meaning we just talked about how there are differences in products and brands. And are they advertisements? And you can probably guess the answer is no. This is just the delivery of the message that you're trying to send. So what is a brand? Well, it's the culmination of all of these things. The brand is defined here. It's a name, term, sign, symbol, design, or some combination of these things that are used to help identify the products of one seller from those of competitors. So in other words, it's that way that you can identify a product or a good or a service, and in a way that the buyer has a different perception of it. A lot of people say, well, what makes a good brand? And in sports, what makes it great for us in branding is we are able to both create a product that is of high quality in a way that a consumer has some sort of respect for it, but at the same time, there are emotional triggers that come from being a sports fan. And it comes from this, one thing I wanted to show you was this idea of a love mark. So the book I'm showing you right here on your cameras, on your screen, is a book called Love Marks. It's the future behind branding, called Love Marks. This is where the idea where I'm showing you right now comes from. Essentially what this book by Kevin Roberts, who was the CEO of a advertising firm, Saatchi & Saatchi, the way they approached branding. They went beyond just saying, here are brands that we create. Rather, they said, here are love marks that we're creating. You can see on this chart I have on the screen, there's a high amount of respect and a high amount of love when we're talking about love marks. If we break it down, products, again, those homogeneous items the company makes, really there's no emotional trigger, and so there's no love for the product. And while a product is pretty much does its basic limited functionality, there's not a whole lot of respect. If you look to the right, we have fads. Fads are defined as anything that is short sustained sales. And part of the reason that is it's essentially a product that isn't providing value, possibly in the sense of an emotional trigger. So think of the fads across the history of the United States. First thing that comes to mind is Beanie Babies. Right? There was an emotional connection people had with collecting those things. But really, what did they do for you? And so that's what we're talking about, the respect. On the top left quadrant of this chart, you see brands, where there's a low amount of love, but a high amount of respect. This is their argument of what most people do, and that they don't think about, yeah, they create a great product, and the product categories underneath that brand's umbrellas say something about who they are, and there's a high amount of respect for it, and people buy it for that reason. But their argument is that if you're able to create an emotional attachment or connection with consumers with the brands that you're creating, then you're moving to the next level in creating what we'll talk about in a little bit, brand loyalty. And that is a high amount of love and a high amount of respect. So with that, how do we look at brand loyalty? Well, there are three different ways to look at brand loyalty. And we'll start at the very basic concept. And I want you to imagine you are walking into a convenience store. And in this convenience store, you walk up to the display case, the cooler, and you want to buy a soda. And when you walk up, you see basically three different brands. You see Coca-Cola, you see Pepsi, and you see Dr. Pepper. If you see those and recognize that there are differences between those, then what we're talking about is if you can recognize that there is a Coca-Cola and Pepsi and Dr. Pepper, and later on I asked you what the brands were and you can recognize those, we're talking about the most basic level of brand loyalty, and that is brand recognition. The consumer is aware of your product and it can identify it if it basically was put into a lineup. If you walk in and you know that there are differences between those and can understand basically which brands they are, you are basically at the level of brand recognition. However, if you walk up to that same display case and you see the Coke and the Pepsi and the Dr. Pepper, and you reach in and you choose, let's say, Coca-Cola, but you do that because in the past, last time you came in and you recognized the differences, you chose Coke, you tried it, and you liked it. Then this point, we're saying that you have a brand preference. You relied on your previous experiences previous experiences with Coca-Cola, and so because of a positive experience, you decided to choose it again. However, if you walk into that same display case and you had previous experience with Coca-Cola, but you notice that the Coca-Cola section is sold out, and you decide, you know what, oh well, I'll just get a Pepsi or a Dr. Pepper. At this point, we're still in that brand preference stage. I rely on my previous experiences, but if my preferred brand is not there, I'll move on to something else. The one we're trying to get to, obviously any one of these levels for marketers is good, but what we're really trying to get to is this last one. As marketers, our job is to get people to be brand insistent. Brand insistence means when I walk up to that display case and I see Coca-Cola is sold out, but I am a brand insistent on Coca-Cola, I'm going to walk out of the store and drive to the next one down the street to try to find Coca-Cola. It's refusing all of the alternatives that are out there for you, yet you extensively search for a desired merchandise. Another way to look at this is the same thing. I just wanted to show you a different way of looking at it. On the very far left on this continuum that people fall on is this recognition. If I have brand recognition, I'm aware and I can identify the product. If I have brand preference, then I rely on my previous experiences to help make decisions on what brands I purchase. And where we're trying to get to is the last one, and that is brand insistence, where I refuse all of the alternatives and I seek only that brand and go out of my way to find it. So a few more terms that I want to go over briefly is this idea of brand identity, brand experience. In the very bottom left of this quadrant, you'll see brand loyalty. I'll define that in a second. And then brand equity, which is where we're going to transition into the next video. So let's talk just this example of team branding. This is obviously, if you've seen this, most of you have seen this logo that's on the screen, and you can probably tell me that it's the Texas Rangers. Part of it is this identity. So part of it is the logo, but brand identity is symbolized as the brand's differentiation from competitors. It's really the fundamental recognition of consumers. It can be anything from logos to product packaging. So when I buy we'll take the Coca-Cola example. Coca-Cola has the legal rights to the shape of the bottle of Coca-Cola. The same is true for Pepsi and Dr. Pepper, and you could probably take the labels off of those sodas and you could probably see the differences because of the brand identity that comes from just the packaging. That's a non-sport example, but anything such as a logo or any type of design that makes you think of a brand and how it differentiates from competitors is what we're talking about, brand identity. The second one is brand experience. Brand experience is defined as the interaction, the reaction, or the emotional connection or experience consumers feel when they engage with a brand. If I go to a game, how the ticket taker interacts with me, how I respond to the video messages on the board, how I become more engaged in technology at the facility. These are all part of the brand experience, which is actually one of the E's of brand equity, which we'll get to in the next video. Then brand loyalty. It makes you question why people would paint their faces like this in the picture there. But the definition, again, we talked about the three different types of brand loyalty. The definition of brand loyalty is a consumer's commitment to repurchase the brand's goods and services and display positive behaviors toward that brand. The last term I want to talk about is a transition into the next video, and that is brand equity. Brand equity is the value of the brand based on consumer attitudes about brand attributes, basically parts of that brand, the awareness that people have for the brand, and the favorable outcomes that come from being a repeat user of that brand. So again, brand equity is the value. And I'll talk in the next video about how brand equity is really how many organizations are focusing in their marketing efforts.